This week we'll be studying personality. So personality is usually thought of as our characteristic manner of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And so different theorists proposed ideas about how personality develops over the lifespan and what it's all about. So if you look at the next several slides, you'll see an outline of the chapter, and then I'll pick up with audio as the chapter actually begins. So, according to some professionals, each personality theorist ought to have three concerns. They ought to be able, in their theory, to describe how every human is like every other human, or explain human nature. The second concern is due to cultural similarities. And so that is how every human being is like some other human beings. So we're all alike in some fashion. And the third concern is how every human is like no other human being, and so our uniqueness. So as you see on the slide, a good theory explains why we're alike and why we're different. So personality is often defined as a person's characteristic pattern of thinking, of feeling, and behaving. And so we see on the slide the seven dwarfs. Each of them is named according to their primary personality characteristic. So each dwarf has a distinctive personality or personality style. Now we're going to look at the famous Sigmund Freud, born in 1856, died in 1939. And he developed the first comprehensive theory of personality known as the psychoanalytic perspective. And so in his clinical practice, Freud encountered people who were referred to him from other doctors and neurologists who had neurological symptoms, symptoms of the nervous system, that could not be explained in just physical terms. And so this began Freud's speculation about unconscious processes and how they can impact our psyche and symptoms. So Freud's theory includes the idea of the unconscious mind, psychosexual stages of personality development, and defense mechanisms that each of us use as part of our personality. And so I'll talk about these three terms in the next slide. Freud believed that when we have unacceptable or disturbing thoughts, wishes, feelings, or memories, we want to push them out of our awareness. We don't want to feel anxious and we don't want to be in distress. So we push them into what he called our unconscious mind so that we can better function on a day-to-day basis. The problem with this is when people do this on a regular basis, they're apt to develop symptoms in adulthood. And so oftentimes these are people who come for psychotherapy. So when people sought out Freud for therapy, Freud used the technique of free association. He had people lie on a psychoanalytic couch, which you see on the picture. And so Freud sat in the green chair behind the couch, and people would lie on their backs facing away from Freud as they free associated to whatever came to their mind. Excuse me. And so Freud thought that in doing this and free associating to our thoughts or to our dreams, we would trace back and tap the unconscious mind. We would trace back to the origin of our symptoms. Freud would encourage his patients to bring their dreams to their psychoanalytic sessions, and he would analyze the dream by interpreting the latent content of a dream. So Freud believed that dreams have two types of content. Number one, the manifest content. This is what we remember when we wake up. But what we remember upon awakening is not the true meaning of the dream. So he believed that the dream was disguised with symbols, and the true meaning is the latent content disguised by various symbols. And he thought that he and other analysts needed to interpret a dream for a client. Freud believed that once we are able to recall our painful and unconscious feelings, thoughts, memories, we have an emotional release, which is called a catharsis, a cathartic release. And once the catharsis occurs, the client feels better, and Freud believes some of the symptoms would go away. Now, what we know is that this may be true for a short period of time, but in the long run, this was not restorative. This did not remedy the problem over a long period of time. And so today, the critics of psychoanalysis believe that psychoanalysis can be very important in terms of getting to know oneself better. They have a better understanding of oneself, but it doesn't necessarily result in the remission of psychological symptoms. Freud proposed two different models of the mind. The first model he proposed is what you see on the slide. So he proposed that the mind consists of three parts: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious mind. So he said, he used the analogy of an iceberg. The mind is like an iceberg. So the largest part, the most important part, according to Freud, lies below the surface. And this is what we can't recall, our unconscious, what we repress into unawareness. And then he said at the surface is the preconscious mind. In the preconscious mind, material is held that's outside of our awareness, but we can access it. So, excuse me, if I ask you what you did last weekend, probably with some thought, you could recall that, unless you had a traumatic experience last weekend. And so this is material that would be in your preconscious. It's not repressed because it's not causing you any disturbance. And then what's within our awareness is contained in our conscious mind. Freud also proposed what he called a structural model of the mind. So he talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. And he believed that personality develops as a result of our efforts to resolve conflicts between our biological impulses and social restraints, which he called the superego or the conscience. And so the id is present at birth. If you look at the next slide, I'll keep talking on this slide, but if you look at the next slide, you see the id unconsciously strives to satisfy our basic drives, our basic sexual and aggressive drives. And it operates on what Freud called the pleasure principle. It wants immediate gratification. And so if you think of a baby cries and cries until he or she gets what it needs or wants. So it's id dominated. Okay, then the next part of the mind that develops is the ego. So the ego is the executor of personality. It mediates the demands of the id and the superego. So we want to do something. Let's say someone goes in a store and they want to steal something. Hopefully their superego helps and says, you know, you're really not supposed to do this. This isn't a good thing to do. At the very least, you'll get caught and you need to pay the consequences. This isn't right. And so the ego is balancing the wants of the id with the wants of the superego. Okay, the superego, as I said, is the conscience. It provides us standards for judgment, which we incorporate during childhood by way of our parents. Freud believed that personality developed early in life. He believed that by the age of 5 or 6, personality was pretty well formed. And he also believed that personality developed in a stage-like fashion. And he proposed stages of development that he called psychosexual stages. So he proposed that during each stage, the id would get pleasure from a particular sensitive area of the body he called an erogenous zone. On this slide, you see the 5 psychosexual stages proposed by Freud. So from birth to about 18 months, he believed children were in what he called the oral stage of development. And this is a time in life where the baby's pleasure centers on the mouth. And so sucking, biting, chewing, infants pick up something, they automatically put it in their mouth to explore the world. And Freud believed this gave them the most pleasure, or it gave the id its most pleasure. Then, from 18 months to 36 months, children, he believed, are in the anal stage of development. And so this is when pleasure focuses, according to Freud, on bowel and bladder elimination. And what the child is basically doing is coping with demands for control over their environment. The third stage he called the phallic stage, from ages 3 to 6. And he said the pleasure zone is the genitals. And this is when he believed children go through coping with incestuous sexual feelings. So this is where people roll their eyes about Freud, that he's really off base about this phallic stage. And I'll talk later about the Oedipus complex. Okay, latency is the 4th stage, 6 years to puberty. And he believed that this was a time when sexual feelings become dormant. And we know that during school age, this is actually when sexual feelings begin to become more prominent. Okay, then the genital stage from adolescence onward, and this is when we see a maturation of sexual interest. Freud believed that it was important that parents not over-gratify a child or under-gratify a child at any stage in development. And he thought that over-gratification or under-gratification could lead to what he called a fixation, that kids, as they grew up in adulthood, when they were stressed, would revert back to that stage of development at which they were either over-gratified or under-gratified. For example, if every time a baby cries, mom gives it a pacifier or a bottle or something to eat, then the child is overgratified. And so then in adulthood, a child might, when stressed, revert back to the oral stage and overeat or drink too much, etc. So we hear about oral fixations, anal fixations. This was Freud's doing, if you will. Freud called a boy's sexual desire for his mother and feelings of jealousy and hatred for his rival, his father, the Oedipal complex, or the Oedipus complex. At first, he called a girl's desire for her father the Electra complex, and later he dropped that term and talked about the Oedipus complex from Oedipus Rex, in which Oedipus kills his father and marries his mother, the ultimate tragedy. So again, this is where people roll their eyes at Freud. Now, there's some basis in reality. Oftentimes you hear little girls saying they're going to marry their dad when they grow up, or boys are going to marry their mother. But this is not sexuality in the way we think about it in terms of mature sexual attraction. So the Oedipus complex, and at first for girls, the Electra complex. So Freud proposed ego defense mechanisms. This is one part of Freud's theory that's upheld by many people. You'll probably hear about defense mechanisms in various areas of life as you proceed through adulthood. So he believed that the ego is bombarded by wishes of the id, wishes of the superego, and also by external reality, mom, dad, bosses, coaches, teachers, etc., and that this can create a lot of anxiety. So in order to function, oftentimes people resort to defense mechanisms. So they distort reality, and they do this unconsciously. And so when we use any of the defense mechanisms, Freud believed we're using two. First, we repress. We banish anxiety-arousing thoughts and feelings from our conscious mind into our unconscious mind. And sometimes that's the only defense mechanism we use. Okay, but there are others that I'd like you to know. So you can go back to your book to get other examples, and I'll talk through now the rest of the defense mechanisms. So regression. Okay, so keep in mind, people do this unconsciously. So people may be really anxious and they retreat to a more infantile stage of development. And so a person as an adult may find themselves sucking their thumbs or pulling out a stuffed animal from childhood or wanting really soft foods like baby food type foods. And so regression. And so early in life, life was less stressful. And so we unconsciously revert back to behaviors from earlier in life to reduce anxiety. The next defense mechanism is reaction formation. This is when the ego unconsciously switches unacceptable feelings or impulses into their opposite. Okay, so let's say you're married, you have kids, and you find that you begin to hate your spouse. Okay, and this is pretty anxiety arousing. So you may push these feelings into your unconscious and begin to profess your undying love. So you don't know what you're doing. This is an unconscious process. So in Macbeth, we have the lines from Lady Macbeth, or about Lady Macbeth, the lady doth protest too much, a reaction formation, the opposite of what you're actually feeling or wanting to do. Projection. So in projection, people disguise their own threatening feelings and project them out or attribute them to someone else. So let's say you find the feeling of anger quite unacceptable, and you're angry with your best friend. You see your best friend and you say to your best friend, "Why are you angry with me?" And your best friend might say, "I'm not angry. Where's that coming from?" So you've projected your anger onto someone else to decrease your anxiety about the threatening impulse of anger. Next is rationalization. Most reasonably intelligent adults on occasion use rationalization. So we offer ourselves, again, unconsciously, self-justifying explanations instead of dealing with the more threatening unconscious reasons for our behavior. So let's say you get a test back, you didn't do very well, and you didn't study at all, but you begin to say, "Well, I failed because the teacher is unfair. The test was way too difficult." Okay, this is sometimes called the sour grapes defense mechanism, based on Aesop's fable of the fox and the sour grapes. The fox sees some luscious grapes on a vine and he hops up on a wall to reach the grapes, and he tries and tries to no avail to get these grapes, and eventually he stops trying and he says, I didn't want those grapes. They would have been sour." So we apply for a job, we don't get the job we want, and we think, that would have been a bad fit. That wouldn't have been a good job for me. So rationalization. Next, excuse me, is displacement. And displacement, as you see on the slide, shifts sexual or aggressive impulses toward a more acceptable or a less threatening person or object. So we redirect our anger toward a safer outlet. So let's say you're at work and you feel your boss is being really unfair, and you don't feel that you can say anything, and you come home and unconsciously pick a fight with your younger sibling or a roommate or someone who's less threatening than your supervisor. That would be displacement, taking out anger on a less threatening target. The people who studied with Freud and the people who came after Freud are called the Neo-Freudians. Neo, as you know, meaning new. And so in some ways they agreed with Freudian theory, and in other ways they disagreed. And so their agreements were about the following. They agreed with Freud about personality structure, about the importance of the unconscious mind. They believed that childhood shaped personality, and all of them agreed with anxiety and defending our sense of self or our ego, so defense mechanisms. So all the Neo-Freudians have some version of Freud's defense mechanisms. The Neo-Freudians, unlike Freud, put more emphasis on the conscious mind. And so they looked at the ego in more depth than did Freud. And they disagreed with Freud on his emphasis with sexual and aggressive motives. Many people disagreed with Freud in terms of his emphasis on sex and aggression. Like Freud, Alfred Adler, who initially studied with Freud, believed in childhood tensions, but he believed these tensions were social in nature, not sexual. So a child's relationships with significant people early in life are what helps develop personality. So Adler is known for his term inferiority complex and feelings of inferiority. He thought just by the fact that children are born little and helpless, they've come into life feeling inferior to these big, powerful adults. And so feelings of inferiority, he did not believe were all bad, that they actually motivated us to grow and strive for superiority, not being better than someone else, but superiority in terms of becoming our best possible selves. Now, he believed that if we don't resolve our sense of inferiority, as we try to move beyond those feelings, an inferiority complex can result. Like Adler, Karen Horney, another neo-Freudian, believed in the social interactions of childhood as being formative for personality. So she was also known as the first to propose a feminine psychology. Freud did not understand women very well, and he actually admitted that, which was quite unusual for Freud. So Freud assumed that women have weak superegos and that they suffer from penis envy. And Karen Horney countered that. So she's known for her social emphasis on development, personality development, and her feminine psychology. The next neo-Freudian is Carl Jung. Carl Jung was chosen by Freud to become his successor, but eventually, like other people in Freud's circle, he was eventually excommunicated because he disagreed with Freud. Freud could not tolerate disagreement with his way of thinking. So Carl Jung believed in the collective unconscious mind. This is the most controversial of all Jung's ideas. So he, like Freud, believed in a personal unconscious mind, but he also thought we had an unconscious mind which contains a common reservoir of images, or what he called archetypes, derived from our species past. So he believed that this is why many cultures share myths and images such as universal symbols like the mother, death, the Joker, the hero, that no matter when you're born or where you're born, you can identify with these archetypal universal experiences. So Jung, unlike Freud, had a spiritual bent. Freud thought religion was a crutch and that people sought out religious beliefs in order to quell their anxiety about death. But Jung believed that our goals for the future and our spiritual aspirations were very important in our growth and development. Erik Erikson is another neo-Freudian, and he proposed psychosocial stages of development. So he thought, again, like Adler and Horney, that our relationships with other people, our social environment, is what shapes our personality. And he also believed that personality develops across the entire lifespan, that we continue to develop through adolescence and through our entire adult life until the day we die. So he proposed 8 stages of psychosocial development. And so when we get to the chapter on human development, we'll go into those stages in detail. Now, the Freudians and the neo-Freudians believed that in order to adequately assess personality, we would need an instrument that would tap the unconscious mind. And so various people devised tests or psychological instruments that were called projective tests. And so what they did was present a person with an ambiguous stimuli, okay, like an ink blot. And they would ask the person what they saw. And they believed that the person would project the contents of their unconscious mind onto this stimulus that was quite ambiguous. The thematic apperception test, known as the TAT, was developed by Henry Murray, and it's a projective test in which people are shown a series of cards. So you see two examples on the slide. And so the person is asked to make up a story about the various scenes on the 20 different cards. And so Murray believed that people were expressing their inner feelings and interest through the stories that they made up. The most famous projective test is the Rorschach inkblot test. It was developed by Hermann Rorschach back in the 1930s, and he dropped ink on a card. He would fold the card in half to get symmetrical designs. And he did this over 100 times and selected 10 ink blots to identify, again, people's inner feelings, and he would interpret their responses to the ink blots. So these were more ambiguous than the TAT cards. After a test constructor designs a test, they need to, before using this with the general public, they need to test for reliability and validity. So reliability is consistency of results, and validity is about whether or not the test actually measures what it is supposed to measure. Now, with the criticisms of projective test, we found that the research has found that trained raters often come up with different interpretations. And so we have low, what is called inter-rater reliability on these projective instruments. Now, projective tests are also criticized because they may overdiagnose. So they may misdiagnose a normal individual as having some type of psychopathology when they don't. In evaluating the psychoanalytic perspective, through research, we have found that personality actually develops throughout life, like Erikson proposed, and it's not fixed in childhood, as Freud contended. Freud underestimated peer influence on individual personality development. And research tells us that peer influence can be as powerful as parental influence. We also know that gender identity develops before 5 to 6 years of age, which is unlike Freud's contention. There may be other reasons for dreams, according to modern research, besides wish fulfillment. Freud thought most dreams were about fulfilling a wish in our sleep. Okay. Freud talked about slips of the tongue. So let's say you mean to say 6 and instead you say sex. Freud would say that that was significant, that that was a manifestation of your unconscious wishes. But we know now that verbal slips can be explained in terms of cognitive processing of verbal choices. Okay, and lastly, suppressed sexuality leads to psychological disorders, according to Freud, but sexual inhibition has decreased over the years, but psychological disorders have not. Freud was quite negative about human nature. He thought that we would all self-destruct or harm others if we did not have the constraints of society. He reduced all human behavior to primitive sexual and aggressive drives. And following Freud, we had the behaviorists whom we studied in the chapter on learning. And they were very mechanistic. They thought we could shape almost any type of behavior. So the humanist in the 1960s became discontent with both Freud's negativity and the mechanistic views of the behaviorist. So we see on the slide pictures of Maslow and Rogers, two very prominent humanists. You may be familiar with Maslow by way of his hierarchy of needs. He proposed that as human beings, we are motivated by a hierarchy of needs, that this is an innate urge to become our best possible selves. So we begin life with needing to satisfy our physiological needs, so food, clothing, and shelter. And if you look at his pyramid of needs, you see they're followed by safety, then belonging, then esteem needs, and finally, at the top of the pyramid, self-actualization, so fulfilling our potential. And Maslow contends that no one actually fulfills their potential entirely, but we have this innate desire to move towards self-actualization. Unlike the other personality theorists that I have so far talked about, Maslow was interested in the qualities of healthy people. What was a mature, healthy adult like? What qualities did they possess? So Maslow studied many people from history and from his contemporary society and came up with the following list of qualities of healthy, well-adapted people. So he said, as adults, we are self-aware, self-accepting, open and spontaneous, loving and caring, not paralyzed by others' opinions, that we're not so much self-centered as problem-centered, that we focus on solving problems and solving or finishing tasks. So humanism, oftentimes called the third force in psychology, referring to psychoanalysis as being the first force, behaviorism being the second, and humanism being the third. Humanism is concerned with the individuality and the self-actualization tendencies of an individual. So like Maslow, Carl Rogers also believed in self-actualization. And he believed that people know themselves better than anyone else, unlike Freud, who thought he had to analyze everything for his client. And he believed that it was really important to give people unconditional positive regard. And so what this means is that we give people an attitude of acceptance despite their flaws and their shortcomings. And he thought that if we provided, as you see on the next slide, 3 conditions for change, that's all someone needs in order to move toward self-actualization. So Rogers proposed that therapists didn't need to learn a lot of techniques or a lot of interventions, that what they needed to do for their clients was provide these 3 conditions in order for the client to change and grow. And so these are genuineness. Okay, that the therapist is real, the therapist is genuine, unlike Freud, who sat behind the client or the patient on the psychoanalytic couch and analyzed whatever it was that they told him by way of free association. you see on the slide, the previous slide, Roger's sitting with a group of people. So we sat face to face, his therapist, or we do sit face to face. We're genuine. We give people unconditional positive regard. We accept them no matter what they tell us. And we're empathic. So we try to understand a person's experience through his or her own perspective. We try to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. Now, he believed that these were not only necessary for change, but they were sufficient. That was all you needed to do. So most therapists today agree that these are necessary, that we need to be real or genuine, empathic. We need to accept our clients as they are. But oftentimes we need other interventions as well. As you can imagine, the humanist assessed personality quite differently from the psychoanalytic folks. So Rogers would use what he called the Q sort, a test of how people perceive or describe themselves. And he would ask people about their ideal self, and he would ask them about their real self, so the person they would like to be and the person they actually are. And he felt that if the two descriptions were quite close, the individual had a positive self-concept. But what he found in people who came to him for therapy is that there was usually a pretty large discrepancy between the real self and the ideal self. So he would give this assessment of the self prior to therapy, somewhere during therapy, and then after therapy to assess if the change had occurred in self-concept. So if the discrepancy between the real and ideal self was less after therapy. So in evaluating the humanistic perspective, we see that there are three basic criticisms. The first is that the concepts in humanism are somewhat vague and subjective, and they lack scientific basis. Humanism encourages individualism, and on the negative side, this can lead to self-indulgence, selfishness, and an erosion of moral constraints. The third criticism is that humanistic psychology fails to appreciate the reality of our capacity for evil. Okay, it's overly optimistic about human nature in the critic's point of view. So on the previous slide, you were asked to write down 5 to 7 adjectives to describe yourself, to describe your personality. And so the words you wrote down would be your personality traits. And so we're beginning to look at a different perspective, and this is the trait perspective of personality. So an individual's unique constellation of durable traits or dispositions and consistent ways of behaving constitute one's personality. So examples: honest, dependable, moody, impulsive, etc. So trait theorists believe that each personality is uniquely made up of multiple traits. Okay, so Gordon Allport was one of the first trait theorists, and he, along with his colleague Odbert, back in the 1930s, went through an English language dictionary and identified 18,000 words that represented traits. Okay, and then they condensed them into basic traits. Now, an easier way and a more contemporary way of condensing traits is using a statistical technique called factor analysis. So a factor analysis would show where traits overlap. So for example, words like caring, kind, uh, considerate, those type of words would all be lumped together in a factor analysis, and they would represent, the same trait. So we can do this by hand, and later we're able to do this by way of a statistical procedure, which was much quicker and more efficient. So using factor analysis, Hans and Sybil Ising suggested that personality can actually be reduced down to two polar dimensions. So you see the two dimensions on the slide. The one is extroversion, introversion, and the second is emotional stability versus instability. And they felt that people could fall into any one of the four quadrants. So if you're extroverted and stable, your personality characteristics might include being sociable, outgoing, talkative, carefree, lively, being a leader. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, if you're unstable and introverted, you might be moody, anxious, pessimistic, unsociable, quiet, etc. So we also know that our personality is influenced by our genetics. So brain imaging studies have shown that extroverts seek stimulation. They want to go out and be with people all the time. They want high levels of arousal because their normal brain activity or arousal level is relatively low, versus an introvert who oftentimes needs time alone because they have a lot of brain arousal and they need to come back to homeostasis by way of having less stimulation than the extrovert. We also know that genes influence our temperament and our style of behaving. So differences in children's shyness and their inhibition may be attributed to autonomic nervous system reactivity. With each theory, we see a different way of assessing personality. So the trait theorists use personality inventories or objective tests. So they're designed to gauge a wide range of feelings and behaviors, and they can assess several traits at once. So these are usually inventories that are designed with objective questions. So personality tests are oftentimes called objective tests from the trait perspective. So we'll look at the MMPI and a few others on the next slide. The MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, is the most widely researched and the most widely used of all personality tests. And it was originally developed back in the 1930s to identify psychological disorders. Okay, if you were to go to court and the judge wanted a psychological assessment, the judge would expect that the psychologist or the examiner would include an MMPI. So it's a highly respected personality inventory. And so it was designed by empirically testing a pool of items and then selecting those that discriminated between diagnostic groups. So for example, if people who were diagnosed with depression largely endorse certain items, those items, despite their content, would be included on the depression scale. People suffering from an anxiety disorder, okay, the items they endorsed would be included on the anxiety scale. The MMPI is now in its second edition, In the first edition, we see that there were 10 basic clinical scales. You don't need to commit these to memory, but you can look at them. Hypochondriasis, people who are overly concerned with bodily symptoms, depression, hysteria, using symptoms to solve problems. We no longer use the word psychopathic deviancy, but these are questions that would assess one's disregard for social standards. The masculinity femininity scale is really outdated, examines stereotypical attitudes toward masculinity and femininity, paranoia, delusions and suspiciousness, etc. You can look at the others on your own. Now you see after someone takes an MMPI, they get a profile that looks like the one you see on this slide. So we convert scores to what we call standard scores, and there are different types of standard scores. Here we have a T-score. And so if you score anything higher than a T-score of 65 on the MMPI, 65 or higher is considered clinically significant. So you see depression is clinically significant, as is scale 5 and scale 7, anxiety and guilt feelings. And so before therapy, you see those scales were in the clinically significant range, as was scale 4. And after therapy, everything fell lower. Everything was no longer clinically significant. Now we're going to look at Costa and McCrae, two other trait theorists. Their theory is known as the Big Five. So they believe that all personality can be condensed into 5 basic dimensions. So we know Eysenck said 2 basic dimensions, Costa and McCrae 5 basic factors. So conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. And these are easy to remember using the acronym CANOE. Again, like Eysenck, Costa and McCrae proposed that these were dimensions of personality. So conscientiousness is on one end of a personality trait dimension, and the opposite of conscientiousness would be at the other endpoint. So you see, if you're highly conscientious, you would be organized, careful, and disciplined. If you were the opposite, on the opposite endpoint, you might be disorganized, careless, and impulsive. So all 5 traits have a continuum of conscientiousness, agreeableness, etc. So you may want to look at these and see where you think you fall on these various dimensions. In evaluating the trait perspective, a theorist named Walter Mischel points out that traits may be enduring, as research tells us they are, but our behavior in various situations can be different. So for example, if I observed you in church and then I observed you at, let's say, a football game or a party, your behavior is likely to be different depending on the situation. And so he concludes that traits are not good predictors of behavior. Now, to counter Walter Mischel's criticism, trait theorists argue that behaviors from situations may be different, but average behavior remains the same. And so traits do matter. So if a person is very shy, they may be more talkative, let's say, with their closest friends and relatives, but overall, they're going to be rather quiet and contained. So traits do matter according to the trait theorist. Another perspective is the social cognitive perspective. Albert Bandura believed that personality is the result of an interaction that takes place between a person and their social context. We know now that behavior emerges from an interaction of external and internal influences. So we're back to the biopsychosocial model of behavior and here of personality that you were introduced to in the first chapter. So our personality is the result of biological influences, genes, autonomic nervous system reactivity and brain activity, psychological influences, our unconscious thought processes, what we've learned, how we explain things, are we optimistic or pessimistic, etc. And then our society and our culture also influences our personality. Social cognitive theorists have been interested in exploring our sense of personal control. That is, whether we control our environment or whether we think our environment controls us. So social cognitive psychologists talk about external and internal locus of control. So if someone has an external locus of control, they believe that outside forces are beyond their personal control, and outside forces determine their fate, versus someone with an internal locus of control who believes or has a perception that they can control their own fate. So you may think about this for yourselves. Do you have an external locus of control or an internal locus of control? Martin Seligman began to think that depressed people became depressed because they were unable to control adverse events. So he thought this would be true of animals or humans. And he did an experiment that would not be permitted today because of ethical reasons. He put a dog in a cage that had a grid on the bottom of it with mild electric shock. And he would close the door of the cage and deliver a mild electric shock to the dog, and the dog would try to get out, would furiously try to get out. And so he would shock the dog again, and again the dog would try to get out. So he did this a number of times, and eventually when he turned on the shock in the floor of the cage, the dog just sat down and endured it. So he coined the term learned helplessness, that the dog learned to be helpless, that the dog did not perceive that it had any control over this adverse event. And so he thought this could be true of human depression, that people who are unable to escape adverse environments or events eventually learn to be helpless and thus become depressed. Martin Seligman, the same psychologist who coined the term learned helplessness, is attributed with the beginning of positive psychology. And so what positive psychology does is attempt to look at what goes into human beings feeling fulfilled, feeling happy. We call this positive subjective well-being or just subjective well-being, a sense of being good with yourself and good with your life. So psychology, prior to positive psychology, really focused on human dysfunction instead of, what contributes to a positive sense of self and a positive sense of well-being. Contemporary personality researchers explore what we call the self. Probably this would be equivalent to Freud's idea of the ego. And so I'm going to focus on number 2, the spotlight effect. Research studies how we overestimate our concerns that other people evaluate us, our appearance, our performance, our mistakes. And this is called the spotlight effect, that we often perceive that we're in a spotlight, that people are noticing us far more than they actually do. So a study was conducted, I believe this is in your textbook, in which college students were asked to wear very ugly t-shirts into the classroom. And they were asked ahead of time how many of their classmates they thought would see the ugly t-shirt. And they thought the majority of the students in the class would see them come in their ugly t-shirts. And so the class was evaluated. They were asked to fill out a questionnaire, and unlike the students' expectations, the majority of the students in the class did not notice the t-shirt. And so this is what researchers have termed the spotlight effect. So this can be really important, when we're nervous and we get up in front of a group to give a talk. We may think that our shaky voice or shaky hands may be noticeable to the audience, but most people don't notice all the things that we're aware of about ourselves. We're not in the spotlight. Unless we are depressed or unless we have a very pessimistic style of personality, most people have what we call a self-serving bias. So we accept responsibility for good deeds and for our successes much more frequently than for bad deeds and failures. Now, defensive self-esteem is quite fragile and egotistic. And secure self-esteem is less fragile and less dependent on external evaluation.